Freedom Knows No Color. Chapter 5. The bank of clouds above finally sailed on, exposing the valley of the light of the moon. "This moonlight is good for getting around," Daniel said, "but they could find us easy in it, too." "Maybe so if they were birds flying over our heads," Julian said. "But they aren't. If we hear anybody coming, we can hide mighty fast in that brush." "What's that funny word Uncle Jeb told you, about the white folks who don't like slavery?" Daniel asked. "Abolitionists," Julian said. Julian wished he could read. Then he would know something about such things. But it was against the law to teach a slave to read or write. Thomas had told him that black people in New Orleans often read and wrote in beautiful script. He said that some of these men wore long black frocks like preachers and spoke with golden tongues. Julian hoped that one day he would learn to read and write too. "I never heard that word before," Daniel said. "Me neither," Julian said. "I just hope Uncle Jeb knew what he was talking about." "I'm getting tired," Daniel said, "and my feet hurt." "I'm tired too," Julian answered, "but we have to keep moving while it's still dark." Half an hour later, the sky began to lighten as dawn approached. Julian looked around. There was no sign of the big house with the rooster on the roof. He knew now they had no choice. They would have to hide out for the day. "Sun's coming up," Julian told Daniel. "We have to find a good hiding place to spend the day. Let's head for the ravine over there. We've got bacon and corn cakes to eat, and we've got water. We can hunker down in the brush and get some sleep. Then, when it gets dark, we'll find the house with the weather vane." Daniel scrambled through the brush after Julian. They crawled underneath the branches of a willow tree and sat down. It was still fairly dark, but in another 20 minutes the sun would be up. The boys ate some bacon and corn cakes and then scrunched down to sleep. They took short, nervous naps while the world came to life around them. Every time a wagon rattled in the distance, they awoke and half sat up, ready to run in an instant's notice. Then, about midday, they heard the voices of children in the distance. Julian peered from their brushy hiding place to see 3 black children walking barefoot down a path about 100 yards away. They looked as if they were on some errand. Daniel joined him and looked out too. "You think it'd be safe to ask them about the house with the rooster on the roof?" he asked. "I don't know," Julian said. "We might frighten them. If we do that, we're sure to get caught." But he knew their chances depended on finding someone to help them. And the only person he knew of was the crazy man in the house with the weather vane. He decided to take a chance. He crept out of the brush and looked back at Daniel. "If things don't go right, I'll holler, and then we'll both take off for the river," he whispered. Julian walked across the field towards the children. 2 were little girls who looked to be about 5 or 6 years old. They wore faded cotton dresses and tattered ribbons in their hair. One was a boy about 9 or 10. As Julian approached, the 3 looked at him with wary eyes. "Who are you?" the boy demanded. Julian smiled and said, "My name is Julian. What's yours?" "My name is Robert," the boy answered. "These are my sisters." "Nice to meet you," Julian said to the trio. "My master sent me to find a house with a rooster on the roof. Do you know of such a place?" Robert nodded. "That'd be the Eckert place, but you don't want to go there. Mr. Eckert's crazy." Julian's heart raced. There was such a place, and such a man. "Is the Eckert place near here?" he asked. "We'll show you," Robert said, "but we won't go past the gate with you." Julian hailed Daniel, and the 2 boys followed the children down a narrow trail that was little more than wagon tracks. Julian glanced around nervously the whole way, expecting some white man to appear behind them. "How do you know Mr. Eckert is crazy?" Julian asked the boy. "My mamma's got double sight," the little boy explained, "so she knows. She can see a worrisome spirit. She says Mr. Eckert might be Platt-Eye himself. You know who Platt-Eye is, don't you?" "I heard tales of Platt-Eye when I was your age," Julian smiled. Platt-Eye was an evil spirit with fiery eyes who set on travelers in the woods. He was as large as an ox, and nothing could stop him but sulphur or gunpowder. It was a tale the slaves told on cold winter nights around the fire. Julian wasn't worried about Platt-Eye, though. He was worried about ordinary white men who wanted to put him in chains and send him back to the misery of the cotton plantation. They came to a clearing then, and Robert pointed and said, "There it is. That's the Eckert place." In the distance, Julian could see a large, decaying house, half hidden by trees draped with moss. The gate hung from a single rusty hinge. A weather-vane rooster was perched on the roof. We're not going any farther, Robert said. Thank you, Robert, Julian said. You've helped a lot. The boy looked Julian and Daniel up and down for a minute, and then he said, "You're running, aren't you?" Julian hesitated. It was obvious Robert knew what they were up to. If he lied to him, it would make them even more suspicious in the boy's eyes. He decided to tell the truth. "Yeah, we're running, Robert," he said, kneeling before the child. "But you can't tell anyone, not even your mama. Do you understand?" Robert suddenly looked sad. "I won't say anything," he said. "My daddy ran last year. The dogs ran him into the river. He drowned." Julian heard Daniel let out a long, sad sigh behind him. "We're real sorry about your daddy, Robert," Julian said. "But you take good care of your mama, you hear? You're the man of the family now, aren't you?" Robert brightened a little and said, "I will. I'll take good care of her, and we won't tell anyone about seeing you." He took his sister's hands then, and the three of them ran down the wagon wheel trail and out of sight. "Let's go," Julian said. He headed toward the house with Daniel following. "I still don't feel right about this," Daniel said as they walked. "How are we going to know what we're getting into? Maybe that Eckert man is waiting behind the doors with a hatchet. They said he was crazy, you know." "We've come this far, Daniel," Julian said. "We've got to see it through. Let's just be careful." The boys went through a creaking gate and then crept toward the big front porch. The closer they got to the house, the more dilapidated it looked. The shutters hung like crooked teeth, and boards were missing from the steps and porch. "Maybe nobody even lives here, Julian," Daniel said. "It sure doesn't look lived in." Just then the sound of a wagon coming down the road reached their ears. The wagon was coming fast. The hooves of the horses were striking the hard-packed road like rifle balls. "Maybe those children told," Daniel gasped. "No, I don't think they'd do that," Julian said. "Get down!" Julian and Daniel huddled in the brush near the front of the house. A few scrawny chickens pecked at the earth around them. At that moment, two large dogs came bounding from the woods to greet the wagon. They had massive, lion-sized heads. Julian thought how lucky they were that these beasts had not spotted them as they approached the house. "We're cornered," Daniel whispered. "Don't move," Julian hissed. The wagon slowed as it came around the corner. Julian shuddered, wondering if the children had said something to betray them. Maybe Robert's sister mentioned seeing two black men in the woods, and now maybe this wagon brought slave catchers who were determined to take the boys back. Julian could already see Cyrus Cannon's evil face sneering with glee as they were dragged back to the plantation in chains. Julian could feel the whip, the pain, the blood running down his back. "Thought you could get away, eh?" Cannon would say, taking pleasure in every lash he delivered. "Thought you could outsmart me, eh?" "Pompey! Caesar!" the man who drove the wagon shouted. The dogs romped out to meet their master, and Julian and Daniel finally caught sight of him. He was a tall, skinny man with a straggly gray beard that reached to his belt buckle. His hair was also gray, and it flowed down his back like wisps of smoke. He wore a dirty black coat and wore black trousers. "What now?" Daniel whispered. Julian wasn't sure what to do. The man was white. That said a lot right there. But this man sure looked like the man Uncle Jeb had described. His instinct told him that the old man could be trusted. He decided it was time to find out. He stood up and in a thin, shaky voice said, "Mr. Eckert?" Immediately the two dogs, hackles raised, raced towards Julian. He glanced down at Daniel's terror-stricken face. "Don't move," Julian said. "Pompey, Caesar!" the old man called. The dogs froze in their tracks. "I'm Levi Eckert," he said. "Who are you?" Julian signaled for Daniel to stand up. "We're fugitives, sir," Julian said as politely as he could. "We're trying to get to New Orleans. Someone told me you might be able to help us." The old man's eyes gleamed like two hot coals. His bushy brows stuck out like porcupine quills. He certainly looked crazy, Julian thought. "Inside the house with you," he commanded. He led the way onto the porch, and Julian and Daniel followed. The old floorboards wheezed and creaked beneath them. When they were all inside, the man said, "How did you hear of me?" "Jebediah Sampson. He said to look for the house with the rooster on the roof," Julian said. "He said you were an abolitionist." "Is old Jeb still alive?" Eckert asked. No, Julian said. He died a while back. Eckert nodded. Then he never tasted freedom. Too bad. Julian and Daniel sat down at a large table covered with a tattered linen cloth. The cloth was faded and the edges were frayed, but a chipped vase with fresh flowers sat in the center of the table. Just then a woman entered the room. She was about 60, with a plump face and gray hair tied up in a bun. "Esther," Mr. Eckert said, "can you bring us something to eat? We got 2 hungry boys here. They're on the run." Esther greeted Julian and Daniel warmly and promised to return with food. "Begging your pardon, sir," Julian said, "but shouldn't we maybe hide or something? What if someone comes?" "Here?" Mr. Eckert laughed. "Why, no one comes here. They all think I'm crazy. Now tell me about yourselves." Julian understood now. Mr. Eckert acted as if he were crazy to cover up his activities. Julian was starting to trust this man. Together, Julian and Daniel told Mr. Eckert about the Whitney farm and how they were sold north after Ed Whitney died. They showed him their whip-scarred backs. The wounds were healing, but there would be scars for as long as they lived. A little while later, Esther brought dishes laden with meat and vegetables. Julian hadn't seen such good food since he'd left the Whitney farm. As they ate, Mr. Eckert said, "You say you're heading south, to New Orleans?" "Yes," Julian answered, cutting a piece of meat. "A friend of ours said that slaves can hide among free blacks there." "Bad idea," Levi Eckert said, shaking his head. "You need to head north, where there's no slavery." "North? How far?" Julian asked. "About 1,000 miles," Eckert said matter-of-factly. 1,000 miles? Daniel echoed. "We could never walk that far." "You don't walk the whole way, Daniel," the older man said. "You go by the Underground Railroad." The boys chuckled. "Never heard of a train that takes slaves to freedom," Julian said. "It's not a train," Eckert said. "It's a system of hiding places between here and Illinois. Folks like me and Esther help you along the way. Sometimes you ride in a hay wagon, and sometimes you ride in a funeral procession. Sometimes you walk. The Underground Railroad's been in operation for more than 20 years. It follows the Mississippi up to Illinois. Once you cross the Ohio River into Illinois, you're free." "You mean really free?" Julian asked. "Nobody can snatch us up and send us back to Cannon's plantation?" Levi Eckert frowned. "It's not quite that easy," he said. "There's a thing called the Fugitive Slave Act. It allows them to grab you anywhere, even in the North, and take you back. But thousands of slaves have eluded capture, and they're living free, right now. You just have to be careful. Don't trust men easily once you cross the Ohio River." Julian couldn't believe his ears. A whole system set up to help him and Daniel to freedom. He put down his fork and breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe they would make it after all. That day, Julian and Daniel slept in real beds with soft mattresses and comforters. The beds seemed like clouds of silk compared to the planks at the Cannon plantation. They slept hard the rest of the day and into the evening. Both boys were worn out from running nearly all night long. When darkness began to fall, Eckert roused the boys from the beginning of their trip north on the Underground Railroad. Eckert gave them both shirts and trousers. Esther brought them sacks of food for the journey. They were about to leave when they heard the shatter of glass. A large rock had crashed through the front window of the house. Wild laughter followed the rock's path. Immediately, Julian envisioned a mob outside the house. The slave catchers were no doubt among them. Levi Eckert plucked the linen cloth off the table and wrapped it around him. Then he snatched a burning hickory stick from the stove and flung open the door. "Death and damnation!" he screamed into the dusky evening, wielding the burning stick like a torch.